Christmas Day in Detroit arrived with snow that dressed the broken neighborhood in false hope. While families tore through wrapping paper around cluttered tables, Kim Tae-jun stepped into the deserted riverside laundromat, running from the blood-soaked kingdom he'd built with his own hands. The feared Korean crime lord had spent 15 years proving that feeling nothing kept you alive. Today, surrounded by spinning washers that echoed his sister's last words, that iron control began to fracture. Across the humming room, Alina Bell folded the same towel twice, dragging out her holiday shift to delay returning to the apartment where her husband's absence screamed louder than any memory. Her daughter, Nyla, sat cross-legged on a plastic chair, whispering secrets to a threadbare stuffed bear, completely unaware that the man in the tailored black coat represented more violence than their street had witnessed in a decade. What none of them understood was that a little girl's offer of her most precious thing would obliterate years of carefully built armor, reshape 3 fractured lives completely, and prove that sometimes salvation comes clutched in small hands, holding a toy with a stitched ear and unlimited grace. Kim Tae-jun pushed through the laundromat's glass door at precisely 2:47 p.m., when he knew the world would be elsewhere, gathered around tables laden with food they couldn't afford, pretending December 25th erased the other 364 days of struggle. The bell above chimed weakly, a sound that would have annoyed him if he still allowed himself the luxury of irritation. He didn't. Emotion was a blade you handed to your enemies, and Kim Tae-jun had stopped bleeding years ago. The space smelled of detergent and something underneath it. Desperation, maybe, or just the particular scent of a neighborhood where people washed their clothes in shifts because laundromats were cheaper than hope. He chose the corner bench furthest from the entrance, his Italian wool coat still buttoned despite the humid warmth. Old habits. His father had taught him to always know where the exits were before he taught him to read. Now his father was 10 years dead, and Kim Tae-jun controlled an empire the old man had only dreamed of building. Detroit's Korean underground belonged to him. Every gambling hall, every protection arrangement, every carefully negotiated territory line, his fingerprints were on all of it, though no prosecutor had ever proven anything. He'd inherited his father's organization at 24 and expanded it with methodical precision, earning respect through calculated ruthlessness and the kind of strategic thinking that turned competitors into cautionary tales. People who saw him on the street crossed to the other side. People who knew his name didn't sleep well. The washers spun in their endless cycles, and Kim Tae-jun watched them like they held answers. Round and round, trying to clean what could never come clean. His sister had loved Christmas. She dragged him to store windows when they were kids, pressed her face against glass to see decorations they couldn't afford, made him promise that someday they'd have a tree that touched the ceiling. He'd kept that promise 3 years too late. The penthouse he'd bought after she died had 20-foot ceilings, and every December he paid someone to install a tree he never looked at. Minseo had been gone for 4 years now. Cancer, the kind that moved fast and cared nothing for how much money you threw at it. She died holding his hand, whispering that he needed to let people in, that power meant nothing if you had no one to share it with. He'd nodded and lied, told her he would, watched her believe him because she'd always seen better in him than existed. After the funeral, he'd locked that part of himself away so deep it stopped knocking. Grief was weakness. Attachment was vulnerability. Love was a liability that got you killed or worse, left you standing at fresh graves, realizing that all your power couldn't save the one person who mattered. A woman's voice cut through his thoughts, patient and worn. We're open all day, but the last wash cycle starts at 7. She stood behind the folding station, her dark hands smoothing a towel with practiced efficiency. Late 20s, exhaustion carved into the set of her shoulders, eyes that had learned to assess without seeming to stare. She'd clocked him as trouble the moment he walked in. Expensive clothes, wrong neighborhood, the particular stillness of men who'd made violence their native language. "I'm not here to wash anything," Kim Tae-jun said, his voice flat as winter pavement. "Just need somewhere quiet." She nodded once, understanding or not caring, he couldn't tell which. Then a child's voice rose from somewhere behind the folding table, bright and unconcerned with the day's weight. "Mama, is Sonny cold? Should I put him in the dryer to get warm?" The woman's expression softened into something that looked like it hurt. "Baby, stuffed animals don't get cold. Just hold him close." Kim Tae-jun's jaw tightened. He'd come here specifically because it should have been empty, a place where people had somewhere better to be. Instead, there was this woman stretching her shift to avoid going home, and a child who didn't understand that Christmas was supposed to be spent anywhere but here. He turned his gaze back to the spinning washers, trying to disappear into the white noise of their rotation. But the damage was done. The careful isolation he'd constructed had already cracked, because somewhere in this humid room that smelled of broken dreams and industrial soap, a little girl was worried about whether her toy was cold, and Kim Tae-jun remembered with brutal clarity that his sister used to worry about the same foolish, beautiful things. Alina Bell's hands moved through the folding motions without thought, muscle memory from 1,000 shifts blurring into one continuous loop of survival. The towel between her fingers was still warm from the dryer, and for a moment she let herself feel that small comfort before adding it to the stack. 4 more hours here. Then the overnight cleaning shift at Sterling Medical Complex. Then home by dawn if the buses cooperated, which they wouldn't, because Christmas meant reduced routes and drivers who had families to get back to. She'd stopped sleeping in any meaningful way 18 months ago. The exhaustion lived in her now, permanent as bone, deeper than any rest could reach. It had moved in the night the hospital called, the night 2 police officers stood on her doorstep with expressions they'd practiced for exactly these moments, the night the word accident became a knife that kept cutting every time someone said it. Paul had died at 2:17 a.m. on a warehouse floor, crushed beneath equipment that should have been replaced 3 years prior. Understaffed night shift. Safety protocols ignored because inspections cost money and dead workers cost less than new machinery. He'd complained about it for months, told his supervisor that someone was going to get killed. He'd been right. He just hadn't known he was predicting his own death. The company's settlement offer had barely covered the funeral. Their lawyers had buried her in paperwork designed to break people who were already shattered, legal language that translated to sign here and go away. She'd signed because she had $43 in checking and a 7-year-old daughter and grief that made her too stupid to fight. But the anger came later, when the shock wore off and she understood that Paul had been disposable to them. A line item. An acceptable loss in someone's quarterly report. That anger lived in her now, hot and constant, the fuel that kept her moving when exhaustion said stop. She would not let this world grind down her daughter the way it had ground down Paul. Would not let Nyla learn that some lives mattered less than profit margins. Would not let poverty steal childhood from a little girl who'd already lost too much. Mama, is Sonny cold? Nyla's voice carried from the plastic chair where she sat, the worn stuffed bear pressed against her chest. Should I put him in the dryer? Alina's expression softened despite the exhaustion. Baby, stuffed animals don't get cold. Just hold him close. That bear had been everywhere with them. One ear stitched back on with thread that didn't quite match because Alina had fixed it at 2 a.m. between shifts, hands shaking from fatigue but steady enough to make the repair. It was the one toy Nyla refused to outgrow, the one piece of her father she could still hold. Every dollar counted now. Every choice weighed against survival. The Christmas gifts waiting at home had come from 3 different thrift stores and 2 months of skipped lunches, but Nyla would wake up tomorrow and believe in magic a little longer. That was worth hunger. That was worth everything. The man in the corner sat perfectly still, expensive coat buttoned despite the laundromat's humid warmth. Alina had clocked him immediately. Tailored fabric in a neighborhood where tailored anything marked you as either stupid or dangerous, and this man definitely wasn't stupid. His posture was too controlled, movements too economical. Eyes that tracked exits and angles, that assessed threats with a particular awareness of someone who'd either caused violence or survived it. Probably both. She kept folding, kept Nyla in her peripheral vision, kept calculating. Designer watch on his wrist probably cost more than her annual rent. Hands that had never known manual labor. The kind of stillness that came from absolute confidence or absolute emptiness. She couldn't tell which, but neither made him safe. Still, there was something in the set of his shoulders that looked almost familiar. The way he stared at the washing machines like they were showing him futures he couldn't change. Loneliness, maybe, or grief wearing different clothes. Loss didn't discriminate by tax bracket. It took what it wanted from everyone, left them all sitting in laundromats on Christmas Day trying to wash away stains that wouldn't come clean. His phone buzzed. He didn't reach for it. Just kept that unnerving stillness, like movement might shatter whatever control he was maintaining. Alina recognized that fight. She saw it in her mirror every morning when she convinced herself that today wouldn't be the day she broke. The difference was, she'd already accepted that some things stayed broken. Some stains were permanent. You just learned to function anyway, to keep working and counting dollars and protecting what remained of the life you tried to build. She turned back to her chore, but her awareness never left him. Protective instincts didn't sleep, not when you were all your child had between her and a world that had already proven itself cruel. Paul used to say she was part mama bear, part military strategist, always 3 steps ahead and ready for anything. She wore it like armor now. The only armor she had. The stranger was someone else's problem. Survival was hers. Nyla's school fees were hers. The rent increase notice on her kitchen table was hers. This man choosing the laundromat for his expensive breakdown was just another stranger in a city full of them. But she kept watching anyway. Because fighters recognized fighters, even across the distance of different worlds. And whatever battle this man was losing, it was being waged in the same space where she was fighting her own. 20 minutes passed in humid silence before Kim Tae-jun heard the small footsteps approaching. He didn't look up, kept his gaze fixed on the washing machines, willing whoever it was to recognize dismissal in his posture and turn around. The footsteps stopped 3 feet from his bench. "Mister, why do you look like you lost something?" The voice was high and clear, untouched by the particular caution adults learned after the world taught them that strangers meant danger. Kim Tae-jun's jaw tightened. He lifted his eyes slowly, finding an 8-year-old girl standing just outside his personal space, clutching a worn stuffed bear with mismatched thread holding one ear in place. "I haven't lost anything," he said, his voice flat enough to end conversations. "It didn't work." The girl tilted her head, studying him with the unsettling directness of children who hadn't yet learned that staring was rude. "You have the same face my mama gets sometimes. Like something's missing and you can't remember where you put it." Kim Tae-jun opened his mouth to deliver the kind of cold dismissal that sent grown men scrambling, but the words caught somewhere in his throat. This child stood there in shoes that were slightly too big, handed down or thrift store, holding that bear like it contained something more valuable than its worn fabric suggested. "Nyla," the woman's voice carried warning from the folding station. "Come back here, baby." The girl glanced back at her mother, then returned her attention to Kim Tae-jun with the particular determination of someone who decided this conversation wasn't finished. "This is Sonny," she said, holding up the bear. "See his ear? It fell off, but Mama fixed it. She says when things break, you don't throw them away. You just fix them different." Despite every defense he'd constructed, Kim Tae-jun found himself looking at the stitching. Uneven, done quickly, probably late at night when the mother had more important things to do but had done it anyway because it mattered to this child. "Your mother is a good seamstress," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "She's good at fixing everything," Nyla agreed. Then, with the casual devastation of innocent honesty, "My daddy's in heaven now, but Mama says he's always with us." "Do you have people in heaven?" The question hit like a physical blow. Kim Tae-jun's hands tightened on his knees, the only outward sign of impact. "Yes," he heard himself say. "My sister." "Were you close?" Nyla asked, and the simplicity of it, the lack of adult awkwardness or practiced sympathy, made something crack in his chest. "Very close." Nyla nodded solemnly, as if he'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. Then she did something completely unexpected. She held out the bear, offering it across the space between them. "Are sad people allowed to hold toys? Sonny makes me feel better when I miss my daddy. Maybe he could help you miss your sister less." Kim Tae-jun stared at the offered bear, at this child's most precious possession being extended to a stranger because she'd recognized pain and responded with the only comfort she knew how to give. His sister had done things like this, made gestures of generosity that cost her everything and meant everything. The memory of it was sharp enough to draw blood from wounds he'd thought were scarred over. "That's very kind," he managed, his voice rougher than intended. "But Sonny belongs with you." "He doesn't mind sharing," Nyla insisted. "That's what Mama says love is. Sharing the good things even when you don't have many good things left." The philosophy was so pure, so unbearably honest, that Kim Tae-jun felt his carefully maintained control beginning to fracture. This child had lost her father, lived in a neighborhood where Christmas meant working instead of celebrating, wore shoes that didn't fit, and still believed that sharing joy was possible. Still believed in fixing broken things instead of discarding them. "What's your name?" he asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. "Nyla Bell." "What's yours?" "Kim Tae-jun." "That's a pretty name," she said with absolute sincerity. "Are you Korean?" "We learned about Korea in school. They have really pretty buildings and—" "Nyla Marie Bell." Alina's voice cut through the moment, sharp with maternal authority and barely controlled fear. She crossed the laundromat in 4 strides, placing herself between her daughter and Kim Tae-jun with the protective instinct of someone who'd already lost too much. "What did I tell you about bothering people?" "He's not bothered, Mama. He's just sad." "That's not our business." Alina's hand rested on Nyla's shoulder, gentle but firm. Her eyes met Kim Tae-jun's over her daughter's head, and he saw the warning there. The boundary being drawn. "This child is mine. You don't get to touch what's mine." He recognized the look. Had worn it himself once, when he still had someone worth protecting. "She wasn't bothering me," Kim Tae-jun said quietly. "She was being kind." "She's 8, Alina replied, her voice steady but edged with steel. "She doesn't understand that not everyone deserves kindness." The words hung between them, accusation and assessment and absolute truth. Kim Tae-jun held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once. "You're right. She shouldn't be talking to strangers. Come on, baby." Alina guided Nyla back toward their corner, and Kim Tae-jun watched them go, watched the mother bend down to whisper something to the daughter, watched the daughter look back at him with concern still written across her small face. He turned back to the washing machines, but the damage was done. The walls he'd built had already started crumbling, because a child named Nyla had looked at him and seen someone worth comforting, had offered her most precious thing to a stranger because she believed broken things could be fixed different. And Kim Tae-jun, who'd spent 15 years proving that feeling nothing kept you alive, felt everything. The conversation had ended the way these things always did, with boundaries drawn and strangers remaining strangers. Alina collected their few belongings with practiced efficiency, folding the jacket she'd brought for layering, tucking Nyla's coloring book into the worn canvas bag that served as purse, diaper bag, and emergency kit all at once. The shift was over. 4 hours survived, $28 earned, and the overnight cleaning job waiting in 3 hours if she could get Nyla fed and settled with Mrs. Chan upstairs. "Come on, baby," she said, her voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who'd stopped expecting rest. "Time to go home." Nyla clutched Sonny against her chest, still glancing back at the man in the corner with that 8-year-old certainty that sad people shouldn't be left alone. But she obeyed, sliding off the plastic chair with the resignation of a child who'd learned that grown-ups made rules that didn't always make sense. The laundry cart sat near the folding station where Alina had left it, stacked with towels she'd meant to return to the back room but had forgotten in the distraction of keeping her daughter away from dangerous strangers. It was an old cart, institutional metal with wheels that never quite rolled straight, the kind of equipment that should have been replaced years ago but wasn't because broken things only mattered when they stopped working completely. Kim Tae-jun saw it move first. Just a slight shift, barely perceptible, the kind of thing most people wouldn't notice. But men who'd survived his particular life learned to track movement the way predators tracked prey, learned to calculate trajectories and impacts before conscious thought caught up. The cart's front wheels had found the slight grade in the floor, that imperceptible slope toward the door where decades of foot traffic had worn the concrete uneven. It rolled slowly at first. Then faster. Nyla stood directly in its path, completely unaware, telling her mother something about needing to remember Sonny's bedtime story. The cart gained momentum, 40 pounds of institutional metal and stacked towels picking up speed on wheels that suddenly worked perfectly, aimed like a missile at a child who didn't know to move. Kim Tae-jun moved without thought, without calculation, without the careful assessment that governed every other action in his controlled existence. His body simply reacted, muscle memory from a different kind of life overriding 15 years of cultivated distance. He crossed the space in 3 strides, moving with the economical speed of someone who'd spent decades understanding exactly what his body could do. He reached Nyla half a second before the cart did, wrapped himself around her small frame, and took the impact across his back and shoulder. The collision wasn't gentle. Metal striking bone with enough force to bruise, the cart's momentum absorbed by his body instead of hers. He turned as they fell, still holding her, ensuring that his torso cushioned her landing, that nothing touched her except his arms and the certainty of protection. The crash echoed through the humid space, towels scattering across cheap linoleum, the cart tipping sideways with a metallic clang that sounded like judgment. Kim Tae-jun registered pain distantly, secondary to the immediate assessment. The child in his arms was completely unharmed, breathing steady, no impact anywhere on her small body. His shoulder throbbed where the cart had struck, his ribs protesting where they'd hit the floor, but these sensations meant nothing compared to the relief flooding through him. Nyla looked up at him from the circle of his arms, her face inches from his, and there was no fear in her expression. Just complete trust, absolute certainty that he'd meant to catch her, that his body between her and danger was exactly where it belonged. Then she smiled, still clutching Sunny, and wrapped her small arms around his neck in a spontaneous hug that shattered something fundamental in his chest. "Thank you, Mr. Kim," she whispered against his shoulder, her voice carrying the simple gratitude of someone who'd been protected and knew it. Alina reached them in a heartbeat, dropping to her knees beside where they lay among scattered towels, her hands immediately checking Nyla for injuries with a systematic thoroughness of maternal terror. "Baby, are you hurt?" "Nyla, look at me." "I'm okay, Mama." "He caught me." Alina's hands were shaking as she lifted Nyla away from Kim Tae-jun, holding her daughter close, feeling for broken bones that didn't exist, searching for damage that never happened because a stranger had moved faster than physics should allow. Her eyes met his over Nyla's head, and what he saw there was complex. Fear transforming into something else, the reassessment happening in real time. This dangerous man had just used his body as a shield for her child. Had taken impact meant for Nyla without hesitation, without calculation, with the kind of protective instinct that couldn't be faked. "Thank you," Alina said, and the words came out rough, choked with emotions she didn't have names for. Kim Tae-jun pushed himself upright slowly, his shoulder protesting but functional. "She wasn't looking," he said quietly, as if that explained everything. As if instinctively protecting a child from harm was something anyone would do, instead of what it actually was, the first unguarded action he'd taken in 15 years. Kim Tae-jun stood slowly, testing his shoulder with the clinical detachment of someone accustomed to cataloging damage. The pain was manageable, would bruise spectacularly by morning, but nothing was torn or broken. He'd taken worse and kept moving. What unsettled him was the lingering sensation of Nyla's arms around his neck, the weight of her trust, the way protection had felt less like strategy and more like instinct he'd forgotten he possessed. Outside, the snow had intensified, Detroit winter claiming the day with a particular cruelty of late afternoon darkness. Through the laundromat's glass door, the street looked treacherous, sidewalks vanishing under fresh accumulation, the kind of conditions that made walking dangerous and buses unreliable. "You can't take her out in this," Kim Tae-jun said, the words emerging before calculation could stop them. "Let me call you a car." Alina's spine straightened, that familiar armor of pride sliding back into place. "We'll manage. We always do. The buses aren't running regular schedules on Christmas. You know that." He pulled out his phone, the movement casual but revealing, black titanium case, the kind of device that cost more than most people's monthly rent. "It's not safe for a child." "We're not your responsibility," Alina replied, but her gaze flicked toward the window, toward Nyla who was already shivering despite the laundromat's humidity. Mathematics of survival calculating in real time. Pride versus pragmatism, independence versus her daughter's safety in weather that didn't care about dignity. Kim Tae-jun was already dialing, speaking quietly in Korean, words that carried the particular cadence of orders given to people who didn't question them. 30 seconds later, he lowered the phone. 5 minutes. The driver will take you wherever you need to go. I can't pay for. You're not paying for anything. His voice carried finality, the tone of someone unaccustomed to negotiation. Then, softer, she was kind to me. Let me return it. Alina held his gaze for a long moment, searching for manipulation, for the transaction she knew had to exist because nothing came free in the world she'd learned to navigate. But what she found in his expression was something simpler and somehow more unsettling. Genuine concern wearing the face of a man who'd forgotten how to show it properly. 5 minutes, she agreed finally. Then we're gone. They waited in loaded silence, Nyla between them still clutching Sunny, looking between the adults with the particular awareness of children who understood more than they were supposed to. Kim Tae-jun stood apart, his usual control reasserting itself, walls rebuilding brick by careful brick. But Nyla was watching him, had been watching him, and children saw things that adults learned to hide from. Mr. Kim, she said quietly, and something in her voice made him look down. Why are you crying? He lifted his hand automatically to his face, felt the dampness there that he hadn't registered, tears that had escaped without permission during those seconds when her arms had circled his neck and broken something open inside him. His sister used to hug him exactly like that. Spontaneous, trusting, absolutely certain he'd keep her safe even when he couldn't. The grief hit with physical force, 4 years of carefully buried mourning rising up through cracks that Nyla's compassion had created. He'd cried once at Minseo's funeral, mechanical tears appropriate to the moment, then locked everything away because feeling meant vulnerability and vulnerability meant death in the world he commanded. Now, in this laundromat that smelled of detergent and desperation, control shattered completely. I'm sorry, he managed, the words rough and inadequate. Nyla didn't ask why. Didn't probe or pry or demand explanations the way adults would. Instead, she stepped forward and pressed Sunny into his hands, that worn bare with its mismatched stitching, her most precious possession offered without hesitation. Don't cry, sir, she said, her voice carrying the gentle certainty of someone who understood that sometimes people just needed something soft to hold. You can borrow my toy. The bear's stitched ear pressed against his palm, repair made with obvious care at some late hour when this child's mother had more important things to do but did it anyway because love meant fixing broken things. Kim Tae-jun's fingers closed around the worn fabric automatically, and the dam broke completely. He turned away, shoulders shaking with sobs he'd held back for years, crying in a way he hadn't since he was young enough to believe tears changed anything. But these weren't tears of despair, they were release, grief finally given permission to breathe, the first honest emotion he'd allowed himself since Minseo died whispering that he needed to let people in. Alina watched this transformation, watched a dangerous stranger become something rawer and more human, watched him hold her daughter's toy like it contained salvation. She saw past the expensive clothes and controlled violence to the grief beneath, recognized the particular devastation of someone who'd lost what they loved most and spent years pretending they'd survived intact. When Kim Tae-jun finally looked back at them, his face wet and undefended, he held out the bear. Thank you, he said, his voice wrecked. But Sunny belongs with you. Nyla shook her head, pressing it back toward him. Keep him until you feel better. That's what toys are for. Outside, headlights cut through falling snow. The car had arrived, and with it the end of this impossible intersection. But something fundamental had shifted. In Kim Tae-jun's carefully maintained fortress, in Alina's assessment of danger, in the space between strangers who'd stumbled into each other's breaking points. The black sedan disappeared into falling snow, taillights fading until Kim Tae-jun stood alone in the laundromat parking lot with a child's stuffed bear pressed against his chest. The fabric still held warmth from Nyla's hands, that mismatched stitching rough beneath his thumb. He should have felt ridiculous, a man who commanded Detroit's Korean underground clutching a toy with obvious repairs. Instead, he felt something closer to purpose, the first clear direction he'd experienced in 4 years of calculated emptiness. He made the first call before leaving the parking lot. Jun-ho. His second-in-command answered on the first ring, always ready, always efficient. "I need information on someone." Alina Bell, late 20s, works at Riverside Laundromat. "I want everything. Employment history, financials, family situation. Everything." A pause on the other end, barely perceptible, the hesitation of someone who'd worked with Kim Tae-joon long enough to know that personal interest was dangerous territory. How deep? Deep enough to understand what she needs. Kim Tae-joon's voice carried the particular edge that meant questions were finished. "I want it by morning." The report arrived at 6 a.m., delivered to his penthouse in a sealed envelope that contained the mathematics of survival rendered in brutal detail. Paul Bell, deceased 18 months prior, crushed beneath equipment during an understaffed night shift at Morrison Industrial Storage. Settlement barely covered funeral costs. Alina working 3 jobs, laundromat day shifts, overnight cleaning at Sterling Medical Complex, weekend retail at a convenience store that paid under minimum wage and didn't ask questions. Monthly income, $2,100. Monthly expenses, $2,340. The deficit covered by skipped meals, deferred medical care, the particular magic of poverty where you borrowed from future disasters to survive present ones. Nyla's school fees were 2 months overdue. Their apartment building had failed 3 safety inspections that the landlord ignored because tenants without options didn't complain. The bus route Alina took to her overnight shift ran through territory where 2 women had been assaulted in the past 6 months. Kim Tae-joon read it twice, memorizing details that painted a portrait of someone fighting impossible mathematics with nothing but will. Paul Bell had complained about safety violations for months before his death. Had filed reports that disappeared into bureaucratic machinery designed to protect companies, not workers. Had died proving that some lives mattered less than quarterly profits. The anger that rose in Kim Tae-joon was cold and focused, the dangerous kind that made empires shift. He made calls through the morning, orders delivered with precision that his organization executed without question. Passive surveillance on their apartment and routes, protection that stayed invisible, observers who intervened only if necessary. Anonymous payment of school fees through a charitable foundation that existed primarily for money laundering but could serve better purposes. Rent reduction negotiated through intermediaries who convinced the landlord that maintaining units properly was suddenly in his best interest. Then the Boxing Day delivery. He spent 2 hours selecting items, moving through high-end stores with the particular focus he usually reserved for strategic planning. Winter coats that would actually keep them warm, boots with traction for snow-covered sidewalks, groceries chosen for nutrition rather than survival mathematics. Toys for Nyla, not expensive things that would raise questions, but thoughtful ones. Books, art supplies, a stuffed bear that might give Sunny a companion. The note took him longer to write than negotiating territorial agreements. For the family who shared kindness on a day when kindness mattered. No debt. No obligation. Just gratitude. He didn't sign it. Anonymity was safer, for them and for him. But he suspected Alina would know anyway. Some connections couldn't be disguised. The delivery service confirmed drop-off at 9 a.m. Kim Tae-joon watched the confirmation text arrive and felt something unfamiliar. Hope, maybe, or the distant memory of what it meant to protect something besides territory and profit margins. Sunny sat on his desk where he'd placed him that first night, visible from every angle of the penthouse that had never felt like home. The bear's stitched ear caught morning light, that imperfect repair telling stories about love that fixed broken things instead of discarding them. Minseo would have understood this, would have seen what he was doing and approved with that smile she saved for moments when her brother remembered he had a heart. "I'm trying," he said quietly to the empty room, to his sister's ghost, to the toy bear that represented a child's certainty that sad people deserved comfort. "I'm trying to be better." The city sprawled beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, Detroit in winter wearing its scars openly. Kim Tae-joon had helped carve some of those scars, had built power through calculated violence and strategic ruthlessness. But Nyla had looked at him and seen someone worth saving, had pressed her most precious thing into his hands and believed he deserved comfort. Maybe she was right. Maybe redemption started with accepting that you could be more than the worst things you'd done. Maybe it started with a child's toy and the decision to protect instead of control, to give instead of take, to choose connection over the isolation that had kept him breathing but not alive. He touched the bear's stitched ear gently, feeling the uneven thread beneath his fingers, and made a promise to people who didn't know they were being protected. He would keep them safe from everything, including himself. The changes began small enough to dismiss as coincidence. Boxing Day morning brought the delivery. Boxes stacked neatly outside their apartment door, no return address, just that card with its careful script promising nothing but gratitude. Alina had stood in her doorway holding Nyla back, every survival instinct screaming that gifts came with prices, that nothing arrived free in the world that had killed her husband and left them drowning. But Nyla needed a winter coat. The groceries meant she could eat properly for 2 weeks. And the note asked for nothing, obligated nothing, signed by no one who expected repayment. She'd accepted it because refusing felt like pride she couldn't afford, then spent the next 3 days waiting for the bill to come due. It never did. Instead, more impossibilities arrived wearing the costume of ordinary luck. The laundromat manager called her into the back office on January 2nd, apologetic and confused, explaining that corporate had implemented a new transportation benefit for employees working holiday shifts. Car service to and from work, he'd said, showing her the memo like he didn't quite believe it either. Fully covered. Something about employee retention and safety. Alina had stared at the paper, recognition forming like frost on glass. The laundromat had never had corporate anything. It was owned by a local family who barely maintained the washers. But arguing meant losing the benefit, meant going back to dark bus stops on routes where women had learned to carry their keys between their knuckles. She'd said thank you and taken the number, hating that she was grateful. Nyla's school called next. The fees were paid, the administrator explained, through a charitable foundation's scholarship program. We submitted your application months ago, and it just came through. Isn't that wonderful? Alina hadn't submitted any application, but her daughter's education was suddenly secure, supplies included, and the relief that flooded through her felt like betrayal of the pride that had kept her spine straight through 18 months of impossible mathematics. Then the rent. Her landlord had knocked on her door with the particular discomfort of someone delivering good news they didn't understand. Clerical error, he'd mumbled, not meeting her eyes. Been overcharging you for 6 months. Here's the adjustment, and your rent's going down starting February. Building inspection came through, too. Gotta fix some things. Alina had closed the door and leaned against it, adding numbers that didn't add up to coincidence, watching the pattern emerge with the clarity of someone who'd learned to calculate angles and odds and the mathematics of survival. These weren't accidents. They were interventions, carefully orchestrated, timed perfectly to address needs she hadn't spoken aloud. She knew who was behind them. Had known since that first delivery, since her daughter's toy bear had disappeared with a grieving stranger who'd taken a cart's impact to keep Nyla safe. The question wasn't who. It was why, and what came next, and whether accepting help from a man whose expensive coat and controlled violence marked him as dangerous was survival strategy or moral compromise. Nyla flourished in the spaces these mysterious improvements created. Better sleep without her mother's constant stress bleeding into their small apartment. Grades climbing from barely passing to honor roll because homework happened at a desk instead of laundromat folding stations. Laughter that sounded like childhood instead of someone practicing for adulthood too soon. Watching her daughter bloom felt like vindication and guilt braided together. Proof that this help was necessary, admission that Alina couldn't provide it alone. The neighborhood changed too, subtle shifts that only long-time residents noticed. The corner dealers disappeared overnight, relocated or persuaded through methods Alina didn't want to examine. Mrs. Chen mentioned that the men who used to loiter by the convenience store were suddenly gone, replaced by nothing, just empty sidewalk where threat used to gather. The buses felt safer, like invisible hands had cleared paths through danger that had seemed permanent. Alina recognized protection when she saw it. Had watched her husband try to protect their family through proper channels, reporting safety violations, following procedures, believing systems existed to help people instead of grind them down. Paul had died proving that faith was another luxury poverty couldn't afford. But this protection came from different sources, operated through different rules, and accepting it meant acknowledging that the law she'd trusted to punish her husband's killers had failed, while a criminal's intervention succeeded. 3 weeks after Christmas, Alina sat at her kitchen table with the car service card in her hand, adding up all the coincidences that had reshaped their lives. Her daughter sleeping peacefully in the next room, school fees paid, rent reduced, winter coats keeping them warm. Safety purchased through methods she didn't want to understand, delivered by a man whose tears over a stuffed bear suggested he understood loss the way she did. Pride said refuse it all, maintain independence, accept nothing that came with invisible strings. Survival said her daughter deserved stability more than Alina deserved the satisfaction of doing it alone. Gratitude said someone had seen their struggle and cared enough to help without demanding recognition or repayment. Suspicion said nothing came free, that debts existed whether spoken or not, that she was accepting help from someone whose world operated on violence she deliberately avoided examining. She picked up her phone, stared at the car service number, made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff while hoping someone had built a bridge she couldn't see. Time for answers. Time to stop pretending these were coincidences instead of choices made by a man who'd held her daughter's toy and broken open in a laundromat on Christmas Day. Time to understand exactly what she'd accepted, and what it would cost. The message arrived at 3 a.m. on a Thursday in late January, when Kim Tae-joon sat in his penthouse office reviewing legitimate business acquisitions that laundered money his various enterprises generated. The text was simple, untraceable, from a number that would disappear before morning. Old debts don't die, Tae-joon. Remember that. He stared at the screen for 30 seconds, recognition settling cold in his chest. Park Min-jae. Had to be. The gambling hall owner he'd forced out of territory 3 years ago, relocated to Chicago with warnings about what happened to men who forgot their place. Apparently warnings had expiration dates, and Min-jae had decided the new year was perfect for testing boundaries that Kim Tae-joon had drawn with other men's blood. The threat itself meant nothing. He'd weathered worse from more dangerous opponents. But the timing was a razor against his throat, because now he had something Min-jae could target if he looked carefully enough. Had connections that made him vulnerable in ways he'd spent 15 years avoiding. Alina and Nyla weren't his family. Weren't even his friends, really. Just people he'd helped, protected from a distance, watched flourish with the particular satisfaction of someone who'd forgotten what building felt like after years of only breaking. But caring made them targets. His past didn't distinguish between blood and concern, only weakness and leverage. He made 4 calls in rapid succession, orders delivered with the cold precision that had built his empire. Double surveillance on their apartment, their routes, everywhere they went. Eyes on known associates of Park Min-jae, anyone who might have followed the money trail back to interventions Kim Tae-joon had made. Trackers on vehicles, security that stayed invisible but absolute. If anyone even looks at them wrong, he told Junho, his voice carrying the weight of promises that ended in unmarked graves, I want to know before they finish the thought. Understood. Should we warn the woman? Kim Tae-joon's hand tightened on his phone. Warning Alina meant explaining exactly what he was, what his protection had invited into her life. Meant watching her expression shift from cautious gratitude to horror, from trust to the particular fear of mothers who'd realized they'd let danger get close to their children. No, he said finally. She doesn't need to know about ghosts. But sitting alone after the calls finished, Sunny watching him from the desk with that stitched ear catching ambient light, Kim Tae-joon confronted the question he'd been avoiding. Was his caring contaminating them? Was protection just another word for bringing violence to doorsteps that had survived without it? His sister had believed people could change, that the man beneath the reputation still existed. Nyla had looked at him and seen someone worth comforting, had pressed her most precious thing into his hands with certainty that he deserved kindness. But Min-seo was dead and Nyla was 8 years old, and maybe they'd both been wrong about what kind of redemption was possible for men who'd built kingdoms on calculated ruthlessness. He touched the bear's mismatched stitching, feeling the careful repair beneath his fingertips, and made a silent promise to people who didn't know they needed it. Whatever came from his past, whatever debts tried to collect themselves, they would never reach Alina or her daughter. He would burn his entire empire down before letting his darkness touch the light they'd shown him. Some stains never washed clean. But maybe protecting innocent things from those stains was its own kind of redemption. Alina made the call on a Tuesday afternoon when Nyla was safely at school and she had 30 minutes between shifts to do what needed doing. The car service number connected on the second ring, professional greeting that she cut through with surgical precision. I need to speak with whoever's been paying for these rides. Not a manager. Not customer service. The person actually funding this. Silence on the other end, the particular quiet of someone recalculating their script. Ma'am, I'm not sure what you don't. Her voice carried the exhausted authority of someone who'd survived 18 months of impossible mathematics and recognized patterns when they emerged. The laundromat doesn't have corporate benefits. My rent didn't drop because of clerical errors. My daughter's school fees weren't paid by any foundation I applied to. Someone orchestrated all of this, and I want to talk to him. Now. Another pause, longer this time. Then, please hold. 3 minutes later, a different voice came on the line, male, careful, speaking English with the particular precision of someone whose first language was something else. Mrs. Bell. My employer would like to meet with you, if you're willing. Hillcrest Community Center, Alina said immediately, choosing neutral ground, public space where mothers brought children and danger couldn't follow without witnesses. Thursday at 2. Tell him if he doesn't show, everything stops. The rides, the help, all of it. I don't accept gifts from ghosts. He'll be there. Kim Tae-jun arrived 15 minutes early, which meant he'd been watching from his car for 30 minutes before that, observing approaches and exits with the ingrained caution of someone who'd survived by never trusting empty rooms. The community center smelled of old coffee and bulletin boards papered with services for people trying not to drown, food assistance, legal aid, addiction counseling, the infrastructure of survival that functioned despite government neglect rather than because of government support. He found Alina at a corner table, positioned where she could see the entrance, and recognized the strategy immediately. She'd chosen her ground carefully, armed herself with visibility and public space. Smart. He would have done the same. Mrs. Bell. He didn't extend his hand, didn't presume familiarity. Just stood there in his tailored coat, expensive and obviously out of place, nervous in a way that powerful men rarely allowed themselves to be. Sit. She gestured to the chair across from her, and he obeyed, which told her something about power dynamics she hadn't expected. I'm going to ask questions. You're going to answer them honestly, or this conversation ends and you never contact me or my daughter again. Clear. Clear. Who are you? Really? Not just your name, what you do, where your money comes from, why you have the kind of resources to reshape someone's entire life like it costs you nothing. Kim Tae-jun had practiced this conversation in his mind dozens of times, searching for language that would soften truth without lying. He found none. I control most of the Korean organized crime in Detroit. Gambling, protection arrangements, territory negotiations. My father built the foundation. I expanded it into an empire. He watched her process this, saw her spine straighten with confirmation rather than surprise. She'd already known, or suspected strongly enough that certainty cost her nothing. The money comes from various enterprises, most illegal, some operating in gray areas that the law hasn't caught up to yet. I have influence because I've spent 15 years proving that crossing me costs more than cooperation. People fear me because I've given them reason to. Have you killed people? Her voice stayed level, clinical, asking the question like she was reviewing a resume. Not personally. Not in years. He held her gaze, refusing to hide behind comfortable distance. But I've ordered things done that resulted in deaths. I've made decisions that destroyed lives. I'm not a good man, Mrs. Bell. I'm just trying to become less of a bad one. Alina absorbed this, her hands flat on the table between them. Why us? Why help people you don't know, who can't do anything for you? This answer came harder, required excavating grief he'd buried deep. My sister died 4 years ago. Cancer. She was the only person who saw me as something other than what I'd become, who believed I still had humanity worth saving. I spent those 4 years proving her wrong, building walls so high nothing could touch me. His voice roughened despite his control. Then your daughter approached me in a laundromat on Christmas Day and asked why I looked like I'd lost something. She offered me her toy because she thought sad people deserved comfort. She looked at me the way Mincio used to, like I was worth caring about despite everything I'd done. "So this is about your grief," Alina said quietly. "We're your redemption project." "No." The word came sharp, defensive, then softened into honesty. "Maybe at first. But then I learned what you'd survived, what you were fighting, and I just wanted to help. Wanted to protect something instead of control it. Wanted to give instead of take. Your daughter reminded me that I used to be someone who believed in fixing broken things." Alina studied him across the scarred table, this dangerous man who'd held her child's toy and wept, who'd taken a cart's impact to keep Nyla safe, who'd orchestrated help without demanding recognition. She'd prepared 3 questions, boundary lines that would determine whether this conversation continued or ended forever. "Do you hurt innocent people?" "No. Not intentionally. My business targets other criminals, exploits vices that exist whether I profit from them or not. I've tried to minimize collateral damage." "Will your world ever endanger my daughter?" He hesitated, and she appreciated the honesty of that pause. "I've taken precautions. Increased protection. But I can't promise my past won't try to collect debts. I can only promise I'll die before letting anything reach her. Can you promise me the truth? Always. Even when it's ugly, even when it costs you." "Yes." "No hesitation this time. You deserve honesty. Both of you do." Alina sat back, running calculations that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with measuring sincerity against survival, trust against protection her daughter needed. This man was dangerous. His help came from blood-stained hands. But he'd answer her questions without evasion, admitted ugly truths when lies would have served him better, and proven through action that he understood protection meant more than control. "Okay," she said finally. "We do this carefully. Slowly. You don't make decisions about our lives without consulting me. You don't involve Nyla in anything connected to your business. And if I ever think you're bringing danger instead of safety, this ends immediately." Kim Tae-jun nodded, relief flooding through him despite his composure. "Those terms are more than fair. This isn't friendship yet," Alina warned. "This is cautious coexistence. Trust gets earned through consistency, not grand gestures." "I understand." She stood, and he rose with her, this unlikely pair who'd found each other through grief and Christmas Day coincidence. "Thank you for being honest," Alina said. "That cost you something." "I see that." "Your daughter taught me that broken things can be fixed different," Kim Tae-jun replied quietly. "I'm trying to learn what that means." They left separately, no promises beyond careful next steps, no certainty except that something had begun that neither of them fully understood. But as Kim Tae-jun drove back toward his penthouse and his empire built on calculated ruthlessness, he felt lighter than he had in years. Truth had cost him. Vulnerability had exposed him. And somehow, that felt like the beginning of actual redemption. September arrived with the particular clarity of Detroit autumn. Summer's humidity burned away into mornings that tasted of possibility and change. Kim Tae-jun stood outside Riverside Elementary watching parents shepherd children toward doors that promised fresh starts and clean notebooks, and felt something he'd stopped recognizing years ago. Contentment that didn't require control, peace that existed without domination. Beside him, Alina checked her watch with the practiced efficiency of someone whose life still operated on tight schedules, though the mathematics of survival had shifted from impossible to merely difficult. 5 months since that conversation in the community center. 5 months of careful trust-building, of Kim Tae-jun learning that protection meant respecting boundaries rather than imposing solutions, of Alina accepting help without surrendering the fierce independence that had kept her and Nyla alive through the worst of it. They'd moved slowly, deliberately. Coffee conversations in public spaces where Alina set terms and Kim Tae-jun listened more than he spoke. Dinner at the small Thai restaurant where Nyla talked endlessly about school and Kim Tae-jun discovered that listening to an 8-year-old's enthusiastic chaos could feel more rewarding than closing million-dollar deals. Weekend afternoons at the park where he pushed Nyla on swings and felt his sister's memory settle into something softer than grief. Gratitude for having known that kind of love, recognition that it could exist again in different forms. He'd never tried to replace Paul. Never positioned himself as father figure or attempted to erase the man whose absence still shaped their lives. Instead, he'd become something else. Steady presence, protective force, the person who showed up consistently and proved through action that caring didn't require performance or pretense. His empire still existed, operated with the same ruthless efficiency that had built it. But increasingly, Kim Tae-jun found himself making different choices, asking different questions. Not just, what expands my power, but, what protects the people who matter? Not just, how do I control this situation, but, how do I help without dominating? The changes weren't dramatic. Weren't the kind of redemption arc that movies celebrated with soaring music and obvious transformation. Just small adjustments, daily decisions to choose connection over isolation, vulnerability over armor, building instead of only breaking. Alina had noticed, had commented one evening over coffee that he smiled more now, that the particular tension he'd carried in his shoulders had eased into something closer to actual relaxation. "You look like someone who sleeps at night," she'd said, and he'd realized with quiet shock that he did. Full nights, dreamless rest, the kind of peace he'd forgotten was possible. "There she is," Alina said now, her voice carrying the complex emotions of parents watching children grow toward independence. "Look how confident she is." Nyla emerged from the car they'd taken together. New backpacks settled across shoulders that had straightened over months of stability. Shoes that fit properly because money for basic necessities no longer required choosing between necessities. Her smile was bright and uncomplicated, the expression of a child who'd been allowed to stay a child instead of growing up too fast in the pressure cooker of poverty. She walked toward the school entrance with her head high, surrounded by other children whose parents had also survived summer and delivered them to September's promise. 3rd grade. New teacher, new classroom, new possibilities built on the foundation of months where food was reliable and rent was paid and her mother slept enough to laugh again. Halfway to the door, Nyla turned back, scanning the crowd of parents until she found them. Her wave included them both, Alina and Kim Tae-jun standing side by side, this unlikely partnership that had evolved from Christmas Day collision into something that felt increasingly like family, even if nobody had named it that yet. Kim Tae-jun raised his hand in return, the gesture feeling natural now, and watched Nyla's grin widen before she turned and disappeared into the building where futures were shaped through multiplication tables and reading comprehension and the small daily work of becoming. "She's going to be fine," Alina said quietly, more to herself than to him, the mantra of mothers who'd fought impossible odds and somehow gotten their children to the other side. "She's going to be extraordinary," Kim Tae-jun corrected. "Like her mother." Alina glanced at him, surprise flickering across her expression before settling into something warmer. "We wouldn't be here without you. I need you to know that. Whatever complicated feelings I have about where your help comes from, the fact remains. You saw us struggling and you cared enough to act. That matters." He wanted to deflect, to minimize, to maintain the emotional distance that had kept him safe for 15 years. But Nyla had taught him better, had shown him that accepting care was as important as offering it, that vulnerability wasn't weakness but connection. "You gave me something worth protecting," he said simply. "Worth becoming better for. I spent 4 years after Min Seo died proving I didn't need anyone. Your daughter walked up to a stranger in a laundromat and reminded me that isolation isn't strength, it's just another way of dying." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last stragglers enter the building, parents dispersing toward jobs and errands and the daily machinery of survival that continued regardless of how much had changed. Kim Tae-jun thought about the man he'd been 9 months ago, emotionally shuttered, moving through wealth that meant nothing, commanding an empire that provided power but not purpose. That man would have walked past this school without seeing it, would have considered a struggling single mother and her daughter as background noise in a city full of people whose problems weren't his concern. But a child had offered him a toy bear with mismatched stitching, had looked at his grief and responded with the simple conviction that everyone deserved comfort. And that small act of compassion had demolished walls that violence and loss had built, had created space for transformation that Kim Tae-jun was still learning to navigate. The greatest power wasn't control through fear, he discovered. Wasn't territory dominated or competitors destroyed or wealth accumulated. The greatest power was this: standing beside someone who'd learned to trust you, watching a child flourish because you'd chosen protection over domination, building family through consistent care rather than blood obligation. Coffee? Alina asked, pulling him from reflection. I've got 2 hours before my shift. Coffee sounds perfect. They walked toward his car together, this partnership still being defined through daily choices and careful boundaries. In the back seat, visible through tinted windows, Sonny the bear sat exactly where Kim Tae-jun had placed him 9 months ago. Worn fabric and mismatched stitching, the tangible reminder that redemption had begun with a child's generosity and a broken man's tears. He'd carry that bear forever, he thought. Would keep it close as evidence that transformation was possible, that the smallest gestures could reshape entire lives, that sometimes salvation arrived in the most unexpected forms, held in small hands that believed broken things could be fixed different. 3 people who'd been alone had found belonging in each other. 3 fractured lives had built something stronger than any of them could have created separately. And if that wasn't redemption, it was close enough to matter. Close enough to prove that Min Seo had been right all along. He'd always had humanity worth saving. He just needed someone to remind him how to find it again.